Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
If air superiority is crucial to modern warfare, then the U.S. Air Force is not up to the task. That's the gist of a detailed look by the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Among the findings, the Air Force is short by, get this, 2,000 pilots. The Air Force itself is what the report calls the oldest, smallest, and least ready in history. Federal News Network's Tom Temin got more details from Mitchell Senior Resident Fellow Heather Penney.
And you're reporting that the Air Force is short by how many pilots?
Well, for fighter pilots, it's nearly 2,000 pilots. That's a significant shortfall.
2,000 pilots relative to what the Air Force says it needs to maintain operations?
Yes, to maintain operations and to do normal career flows, and not only to make sure that they staff the fighter squadrons, but also to ensure that they staff headquarters and they staff air operations centers, that they have the right planners, that they're able to appropriately develop these pilots for potential leadership positions. And most importantly, which people don't really appreciate, you need to have those staff positions filled so that when you go into combat and you have attrition, you have the experienced combat pilots that are there within your force that you can flow forward to the fight. And right now, the Air Force really has all of their pilots in their operational squadrons. They have none of the strategic depth that the nation needs.
And that's been the case for some time now, hasn't it?
Decades. It's been that way for decades.
Well, what's the fundamental reason then? If they've known about it for decades, that's a long time. That's a couple of generations of pilots.
It is. It's several generations of pilots. Well, to be honest, this stems back to the 1990s. This is a problem that occurred when, after the Cold War, we went through the peace dividend. The nation literally cut the Air Force in half. And so the Air Force also cut its fighter pilots, dropped them down significantly. But then as they shut down pilot training bases, they didn't have the production capacity. They didn't have the right force shaping. So, they had gaps within the career flow. And so it really has created this oscillation of across the ranks that the service has never been able to really recover from. And then because the Air Force got so small, when we went and we did the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and then Syria, they've really had to drive their pilots hard. And this has hurt both the pilot corps as well as the aircraft they fly.
And is the requests for budgeting that the Air Force puts in every year for those additional 2,000 pilots that they need as fighter pilots, or do they simply ask for the budget for the staff they have, and that helps perpetuate the problem?
Well, they end up having to plan for what they can actually produce, right? So this is constrained at the pilot production facilities. Now, AETC, Air Education Training Command, is really doing some cutting edge work on how do they leverage augmented reality, how do they leverage simulation, how do they leverage self-paced learning to try to compress the pilot training pipeline so that we can produce a pilot in a shorter period of time. But the real issue isn't just production. What we really focused on is the need to be able to have experienced pilots within the force, because your experienced pilots are the ones that have the better mission success rates and better survivability.
So that's an issue of retention, sounds like.
Absolutely. It's an issue of retention. It goes back to, the Malcolm Gladwell, to get an expert, you need to have 10,000 reps. And how long does it take to make an expert? Well, then it takes 10,000 reps. And so it's a very similar thing with combat pilots. To get an experienced combat pilot, you cannot shortcut. You have to be able to do the number of flights, the number of hours, the number of training events, as well as the simulators. You can't lower the standards if you want the same level of performance.
And you also have to keep them in longer so that they don't bolt over to United Airlines, as the old movie line went.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And, you mentioned that in our conversation that the aircraft that these pilots are flying, they're old, they don't have the same mission capable rates, so we can't fly them as much as we used to be able to. This slows down the rate at which pilots are able to gain that experience. And pilots are only committed, they have an active duty service commitment for 10 years. So the slower it takes to get to that experience level, the less time you have on the back end of that experience actually in the force, where at that point they make the decision, do they stay or do they exit? Do they go to the airlines? Do they go, what do they go do?
We are speaking with Heather Penney, Director of Studies and Research at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. And if someone is a pilot and they come to the end of that 10-year duty cycle, if you will, to be a combat fighter pilot, can they still stay in pilot status for purposes of training and mentoring and planning, even if they're not even be in the cockpit or in the second seat, if that's the case in a training situation, but not necessarily be there for actual combat?
Well, so they absolutely could, but so there the question is, does that individual, do they stay in the active component, so the active duty, or do they go to the Guard and the Reserve? And so they've come to a fork in the road. If they want to continue to serve, do they stay active duty or do they go to the Guard and Reserve? And that's a very big question for a lot of these individuals, because they typically want to, because of the experience that they've had, because there's a number of issues that are impacting their retention decisions, right? We understand that the retention rate has been fairly consistent for several years at about 45%, which means that of those pilots that are eligible to leave, more than half of them do. That's a pretty significant statement. And we know that increasing the bonus, the aviation bonus, it's not the money that matters. I mean, it makes it nice, but it's not the money that matters. There are other more significant factors that are addressing their decision to stay and serve or to leave. So really, the best thing that we could do is ensure that they have a place to land, because often these pilots want to continue to serve, but they are just done with the active duty. They want to go to the Guard and Reserve.
And we've been talking about fighter pilots. What do you know about the situation for, say, bombers and planes that just carry stuff, transport?
So they also have some significant issues, transport pilots. I don't have the numbers for retention rates for those individuals off the top of my head, but we know that just about every aviation career field is fairly stressed.
And we talked briefly about the fleet itself of planes, and now there's a new fighter, a sixth generation under very early development, and then there is the fifth generation, which they're producing, and there's a few hundred of those, I guess. Maybe they're approaching 1,000, and they're being sold around the world. But the bulk, it seems, that get used are the older ones, some of them going back to the 90s, I guess, or late 80s. And
yeah, more like the late 80s. I'll tell you, the F-16 that I flew was produced in 1985. It is still in frontline service.
Yeah, so I
That
guess
is
you can,
old aircraft.
if you want to spend enough on maintenance, you can keep them going forever. But your report says that the Air Force needs to totally recapitalize. What does that mean,
Yes.
and what would that take?
Well, ultimately, it's going to take the resourcing, right? The nation needs to understand that any joint force operation is fundamentally, it cannot happen without air superiority and the support of air power. So for many administrations have sought to divest to invest. What they mean by that is retire the old aircraft and then take that money. And they sort of intend to put that towards future buys. But the challenge is that unless you are actually replacing at a 1-for-1 rate, you retire one aircraft and a new one shows up on the ramp that same year, that divest invest strategy has only resulted in a shrinking force. The Air Force has been utterly unsuccessful in being able to realize their intention behind divest to invest.
And for the platforms that are current, the F-35, I don't know whether there's any others, and this forthcoming one, do you feel maybe overload the requirements and constantly change throughout the process so that they never really catch up with their own program?
Well, so what you're talking about is a planned modernization program. So aircraft that are currently in production in the United States today from the fighter side is the F-35, which you mentioned, the F-15EX at Boeing. So Boeing produces that, and that is a dramatically upgraded version of the Eagle. And then also advanced models of the F-16, which are being exported. They're not being bought right now as a program of record for the United States Air Force. Any aircraft, even if you go all the way back to World War II, has always had a modernization program, right? The B-17, the Flying Fortress in World War II, went through models A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, right? So there's always a modernization program. And that is a way that the service can take a known platform that has airworthiness certifications. It meets the range, the payload requirements, the maneuverability requirements, but is able to upgrade certain elements of performance and avionics to maintain relevance to the battle space.
Yes, somebody told me once that of the 80 or so remaining B-52s, no two of them are identical.
That's true. That's true, because they've been through so many different types of upgrades.
And realizing this is outside the scope of this most recent report, do you have a sense of whether the Navy has an aviator issue with retention and force size? And even, I guess, the Army has an aviation piece. Do we know what's going on there at all?
I did not focus on those services because really, to me, that because of the core element of air superiority in the other air power mission sets, the core mission sets the Air Force provides for the entire DoD, this is a true crisis. And the way that the Navy employs their naval aviators and their air power, the way the Marine Corps employs theirs with their air power, they cannot replace what the Air Force does.
Where's Curtis LeMay when you need him? Heather Penney is Director of Studies and Research at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Where's Mitchell, I guess, for that matter. Thanks so much for joining me.
Tom, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
We'll post this interview along with a link to her report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
Retired U.S. Army General Robert Brown's path to leadership was anything but conventional. Drawn to the military by its unwavering focus on mission, his decades of service in the Army emphasized mentorship, trust, and selflessness. Now president of the Association of the United States Army AUSA, General Brown joined Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, to share insights on making tough decisions and leading with purpose.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today I'm joined by General Robert Brown, President and CEO of the Association of the United States Army, AUSA. General Brown, welcome, and thank you for joining.
Well, thanks for having me, Shane. Really appreciate it. Great to be here.
Talk about why you decided to begin your career in the military, and how did that eventually transition into many leadership roles in the Army?
I think people sometimes have this idea that folks in the military knew from the time they were born they wanted to be in the military, and nothing could be further from the truth. There are some people that are like that, but I think it's the exception. So for me, I was a pretty good basketball player in the state of Michigan my last 3 years in high school. And at the time, there was another pretty good basketball player named Irvin Magic Johnson. There was a senior in high school at the same time. And I remember my parents complaining how parents are with the kids, that he was getting all the publicity. And I said, he's pretty good, and turned out to be okay. Well, he was going to Michigan State on a basketball scholarship, and I got a basketball scholarship to University of Michigan. But then a guy named Coach K, Coach Mike Krzyzewski, was the coach at West Point, United States Military Academy, West Point at the time. So he was the head coach, and he came to my house and was very passionate about West Point. And so I said, okay, I'll visit. And I did my last official visit there and fell in love with the idea of selfless service and all that West Point stood for. The meaning I saw in serving a cause greater than self and defending your nation and the Constitution, just to me, it struck me as an amazing opportunity. So I went to play basketball,
Wow.
and did not intend on staying in, but then lo and behold, like 40 years later, I ended up retiring. So people come in for all different reasons, and for me it was initially basketball, but that idea of selfless service I hadn't been exposed to really struck home.
Well, finding a mission that resonates with you personally matters a lot. Your leadership style, has it changed over time? And then is there a moment that stands out to you as something that was particularly impactful to you in your leadership style?
I think when you're becoming a leader, all of us in whatever field, you're trying to figure out, you're reading and studying about leaders, and if you see a famous leader, say, oh, I'm a little bit like that famous leader or this famous leader, but eventually you come to the realization that you have to be yourself. Yes, you may have to, we all have strengths and weaknesses, you may have to work on your strengths a little more and fix your weaknesses, but Nobody does you better than yourself. And so I think for me, that moment when I was a young leader, what we would call a company commander, so 3-4 years out of West Point, had about 180 soldiers I was responsible for, and to see that tough mission we had, forming a team and working very hard with literally lives at stake on what you do, and then to see it come together was just incredibly rewarding. And it wasn't so much the huge success, but when a soldier would say, "Hey, sir, that was really tough training. That was great. It's going to help us a lot." And, that feedback, it's like, boy, you just feel like you could keep going forever, developing those teams and being successful on a difficult mission.
So I think you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but in your mind, what makes leadership in the Army unique?
Well, lives are at stake. And just about anything you're doing, whether you're saving lives, which you do a lot. A lot of people think, you're in the Army, you just go and you're constantly fighting. No, there's a lot of things we do in the Army, and you spend way more time saving lives. Again, in a disaster, I think the ultimate is you may make a decision and someone's life depends on it. That's a lot of pressure. So we study leadership a lot. And the other thing I think is that it requires a level of trust beyond certainly any leadership in any organization. You can't be an effective leader without trust. But in the military, it's trust at a level that you're trusting folks with your life. And so that is a whole different level of establishing that trust. And it requires a greater level of character, requires a greater degree of care, and I would say love for the people you lead, the soldiers you lead. And leadership is still leadership. The stakes are different, but the same principles that apply in the Army and the military apply everywhere. It's just the stakes are a little greater there, but it's the exact same principles.
Have you ever taken a significant risk, and then what was the outcome?
The answer is yes. I don't believe you can succeed in any field without taking risks. It's going to lead to failure, taking risks. And it's a concern I have today. And to get back to the direct question, I can't tell you how many times I took risks. And I can think of about 12 times where the risks I took almost led to me being relieved and my career being over 40 years. Numerous times, from a young officer to a more senior officer. Now, they're not just wild risks, out of control. These are calculated risks where you think you're doing the right thing. In some cases, that was, there's a leadership thing that's very important, is to give the credit to the subordinates and take the blame when things go wrong. So the risk of a subordinate that's trying to do the right thing, it doesn't work out. I'm not talking about, they feel something immoral or illegal. No, they're trying to do the right thing, but it may not work out the way it was planned, and so they fail. And then you go to the leadership and say, "Hey, relieve me. Don't relieve, Captain so-and-so. He was trying to do the right thing." So you, in essence, take the blame and will be relieved. I've done that numerous times, and and sometimes you have to, I think, to have that trust with those you lead, you have to be able to look in the mirror. And if you're doing the job for a promotion or the next job or to be a general, well, you more than likely won't be and shouldn't be. And I think that's very true in many fields as well. It's not that, you don't want to do your best, but you've got to think of the organization first and the team and first. And so you have to be able to look yourself in the mirror and feel good about who you're looking at, and not that you're out for yourself. That builds that trust in the organization. They know you're going to empower them, trust them. In today's world, in any business, if you look at business, the ones that are exceeding are the ones that are empowering their people, taking risks, and they do extremely well. The ones who are holding them back and making all the decisions at the top, well, they're going to fail.
And people that work for you see that,
yes,
and they're reading that. And
yes,
if you don't do that, then you've lost the trust of every single person on your leadership team, and you might
yes,
as well call it a day. If they think you're in it for
yes,
yourself,
that's right.
Nobody respects that.
That's a tremendous point, Shane. And I would say this is an amazing thing. From the time we're born, we're evaluating those who are in charge of us, those who lead us, from your parents, your teachers, your coaches, your scout leaders. It doesn't matter. You name it. And if you ask somebody who's the best leader you ever worked for, rarely is it the smartest. Rarely is it, whatever. It's the person they knew cared about them or the team and not themselves, right? They knew it. It was very clear. And as a leader, that is absolutely critical.
The last question is always kind of fun and interesting. Who is one person, somebody that you know personally, perhaps someone well known, but someone who impacted your leadership style and why? Well,
the first answer to that would be that I was very fortunate to have many amazing leaders over the years, amazing leaders, and I could name like 10 of them. But the one I would point out for this, I would go back to my days as a basketball player. Coach K would be the guy, Mike Krzyzewski, the winningest coach of all time. My basketball, he taught me how to build a team. And we stayed close after I graduated, and we talked leadership for hours over the years. And in fact, very proud over the years, whether it was 32 soldiers or 150,000, they called me coach. So it was kind of a compliment, I thought. And, and I got that really from him, And at the time, I was playing for him. It was his first coaching job at West Point. And we knew he was really good. I'm not sure I would have predicted he'd be the winningest coach of all time. That's pretty amazing.
What an amazing person to know
and win 3 gold medals coaching the Olympic team and everything else. But definitely that I would credit him the most with building a team, and I was known as a team builder and took a lot of pride in that and enjoyed that in my time in the military.
Well, General Brown, thank you very much for joining
my
me,
honor.
Sharing your
thanks
stories.
For having me.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and really appreciate it. And thanks for doing the podcast on leadership, because it's awful important. We need it everywhere. And I think it's key to our great country.
And thank you all for tuning in. This is Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, reminding you to empower your team and embrace challenges. Until the next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.